So it looks like things are really heating up between Colby Chaos Covington and Ian Garry.
That's right.
Now, both of these guys are heels, so it'll be
Mm-hmm.
very interesting if the fight materializes to see who the crowd cheers for and who the crowd boos when they walk out. But more importantly than that, I think the fight itself, if it materializes, and it looks like it might, is quite an interesting one. And I think it's a difficult fight for Colby Covington. I want to get your thoughts, but just at first blush, Ian Garry, he's 6'3", he's big for the division. He's a very dynamic striker. And we've seen Colby have a little bit of trouble with that recently against Leon Edwards. And, Colby Covington getting towards that late 30s mark of his career. How do you see him having a path to victory? And do you think the fight would be competitive?
So I love the fight, and of course it is a hard fight for Colby Covington. Anybody who's undefeated in their professional fighting record and they've never actually lost and they're only 26 years old, that's a tough night out, period, end of story. But it's also a very hard fight for Ian Garry.
Yes.
Ian Garry, of course, he's had a great rise in the UFC. He's looked almost perfect doing it, but he's never fought anybody like Colby Covington. Colby Covington's been in business only with world champions and former world champions since, 2016, 2017, some ridiculous amount of time where he's been the number one contender. Nobody's disputing that, and he's only fighting world champions. So this would be a major jump in Ian Garry's competition. And I like the fight for a lot of reasons, because Ian Garry showed us a lot of different tools that he was able to use against Jeff Neal. He looked really good doing it. His range management's really solid, and the way he can evade the takedown would cause some trouble for Colby Covington. But Colby Covington is only familiar with 5-round fights. He's only familiar with coming forward, pressuring. It appears like he's still got quite a chin on him, even though he's about 10 years older than Ian. And I don't know if Ian Garry is fully ready for 5 rounds in the UFC. And on top of all that, you have to remember adrenaline and mental clarity is a very real thing when you get to the highest level of this sport. Colby Covington has ice running through his veins, and he makes fight week and the entire promotional side of the fight living hell for the person that he's going against. And a lot of guys crumble under that pressure. Ian Garry seems, when the cameras are on, to not be fazed by any of this sort of stuff. And it seems like he's pretty good at rolling with the punches that the internet's constantly throwing at him, that the reporters are throwing at him, and that even some of the other fighters are throwing at him. But let's not forget, just last year, at the end of last year, they were scheduled to be on the same stage for a UFC pay-per-view event, and one of them backed out, one of them turned away, one of them said, I got a stomach ache, or whatever it was that he said, and backed out of his fight that wasn't even against Colby, but he had a sneaky suspicion that all of Colby's cannons were going to be facing directly at him, and that's Ian Garry. I have a feeling this stuff is getting to Ian Garry, even if he doesn't show it when the cameras are on and when he's got his hand wrapped around Joe Rogan at a pay-per-view. I think Colby Covington would do a whole lot of groundwork early on in the promotional side of this and have him all sorts of flustered by the time he got into the cage. And that's honestly where Colby does some of his best work. And then, of course, you got to match the X's and O's, the skills, the high pressure, the insane gas tank, and the crazy barrage of punches that Colby's going to throw at your face for the entire duration. A lot of people like to point at the fact that Colby doesn't get a whole bunch of finishes, right? They're like, oh, he doesn't finish that many people. But he surely beats the crap out of him. Every time he goes out there, the person that comes out the other side, if Colby got his hand raised, or even if he doesn't for that matter.
Yeah, even Usman took some beatings in those two fights.
Right, they're getting beat up, and Colby likes that. Chael Sonnen came out and said that, Colby doesn't want to finish people. He wants to go out there and beat them up for 25 minutes, and if he was allowed another 25, he'd go on and continue to do that with no finishes. That's a nice way of telling the world that your friend doesn't get a lot of finishes, but I'm still here for the story. I really like it. And to me, honestly, Ian Garry's doing something right, because if you're able to garner the attention from Colby Covington, who has been and still is one of the top draws in the sport and only fights former world champions, if you're able to get his attention, whether it's positive or negative, and you're able to handle that storm, I think you're on the right track. I think Ian Garry's got a couple of fights, especially if he can get his hand raised, away from being a top contender, maybe even getting a title shot at 170, and that's why I think this intrigues Colby Covington.
Yeah, and both of these guys came out and put some pretty absurd stipulations
for
the fight to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously none of that's going to happen. Layla Machado, there's a 0% chance that if Colby wins the fight, she's going to be America's pick of the week girl in a bikini next to Colby Covington.
But can you imagine if she was?
That will never happen. Conversely, Ian Garry saying that if he loses, he will lay his gloves down in the center of the octagon and retire, and he wants Colby to do the same. It's a retirement match for the loser. Yeah. That's hyperbole as well. There's a 0% chance that an undefeated fighter taking one loss in his mid-20s to a former interim world champion is going to call it a career at that. So it's a lot of posturing. It's a lot of talking. But speaking specifically of the X's and O's of the fight between Covington and Ian Garry, it is a very good stylistic matchup. You have a cardio machine and a wrestling dominant fighter like Colby Covington, who knows how to keep you in bad positions, who knows how to do damage from bad positions, who can take the fight to where he wants to take it and has the gas to do so for an entire 3 rounds, or more likely in this case, an entire 5 rounds. Yeah. Now, we haven't seen Ian Garry tested at 5 rounds in the UFC yet. We don't know where his gas tank stands, but here's why Ian Garry is a tough matchup for Colby Covington. He's very long. He's very strong, he's rangy, and he knows how to keep distance from his opponents. And on top of that, he's got pretty dang good takedown defense. So Colby is going to have to expend some energy and take some risk if he's going to take a shot on Ian Garry. Yeah. And it's probably going to take multiple shots for him to get Ian Garry to the ground. And so the question becomes, how much damage can Ian Garry do to Colby Covington when he's entering with these shots? Can Colby disguise the shots well enough to not take any damage on the entry? And that's yet to be determined. But Ian Garry is a lot like Leon Edwards in certain ways, where he's very powerful, he's very dynamic, his striking is confusing to figure out. Even over 25 minutes, it's hard to get a read on him. And when we saw Colby last, we have to be honest, he looked a bit like a stick in the mud against Leon. He looked like he didn't know what to do. He didn't really have an answer for anything that the champion was throwing his way. And while I'm not suggesting, or nor do I agree that Ian Garry is as good of a striker as Leon Edwards, he's a bit of a similar striker, and he's kind of in that same ballpark. He's on the come up. He's a few years away from being as good as Leon, but Leon's a little bit older. But the glaring, elephant in the room here is the fact that there's almost a 10-year age gap between these two, and very few exceptions have we ever seen where the fighter that's a decade older gets the job done against the younger fighter who also happens to be undefeated, who also wins the majority of their fights by knockout, who also has quite a few first-round finishes. So I think ultimately, as much as I've enjoyed the career of Chaos Covington, that career is coming to an end, while the career of Ian Machado Garry is very much at its inception. And so when they meet in this crossroads, I think Ian would have a big advantage.
Well, I think a lot of people look at Colby Covington as one of the guys that breaks the mold. He doesn't like to do what the conventional fighter or the mixed martial artist or anything you want to call it, whatever vernacular you want to give to a competitor in MMA. He doesn't really stick to that. But when it comes to doing the sport justice, when it comes to extending the hand down to the young up-and-coming fighter, Colby's doing it. Look, Ian Garry is a tough night out. He's undefeated. So you can put him in the same company with Shavkat. You can put him in there with Khamzat Chimaev, all those, Jack Della Maddalena. These guys are the future. They're definitely coming, just like Ian's name. And I really think that it's going to take some of these guys at the top of 170 to let them into the good old boys club. And Colby Covington seems to be the first one out of all those guys that's like, all right, bring me the young stud. He thinks he's all that in a bag of potato chips. Let's see what he's got. And I think that that's going to get overlooked because Colby breaks the mold on almost everything. But the fact that he's, pointing his cannons at a young guy like that who seems to be a world beater and has all the confidence in the world. And sometimes ignorance is bliss, and sometimes it's a really good thing in fighting. If you don't think that anybody can beat you, if you truly think you're the best in the world and you've got the undefeated record to prove it, it takes going and getting beaten up by somebody like Colby Covington for 25 minutes for you to realize you're human, for you to realize that you can be beaten. And I think Colby Covington's approach to fighting obviously is to drain him mentally and physically during the fight camp and during the promotional side. But when it comes time to be one of the last 2 or last 4 guys to walk out of a UFC pay-per-view event, which I would assume this would have to be a pay-per-view.
Probably co-main on a pay-per-view.
Likely the first time Ian Garry sees 5 rounds and it's pay-per-view. he's going to start to feel some of those emotions, the same emotions that Colby Covington felt in his first time going out for a serious number one contenders matchup or a 5-round fight. So I think Ian Garry would have to really conserve his energy because Colby's gas tank ain't going anywhere. And Colby would be very smart to decide and disguise when his takedowns are going to come in, right? Maybe the most difficult thing to deal with in a UFC, a mixed martial arts contest, is a well-conditioned, completely fresh wrestler.
Yeah.
Pressure-heavy wrestler. So Colby Covington has to go out there guns a-blazing. If he comes out at Ian Garry and wants to feel him out for the first 5 minutes, that's a big mistake. Colby Covington has to come out there and put the pressure on him. So instantly, Ian Garry's not in there finding his groove. He's reacting. He's moving quickly. He's moving backwards. He's winding up on the cage. He's maybe not getting the takedowns that Colby wants, but he's at least showing them. He's at least starting to exhaust the young man. And Ian Garry would have to get really creative with some of that striking that we saw against Jeff Neal. Knees up the middle, throw some nice uppercuts, evade really well, use that jab hand to really gauge where Colby is at all times. And it's one thing to keep your eyes on your opponent, but when you can keep your hand on your opponent, that really tells you when they're coming, when they're pressing back. And that's something that I noticed Ian Garry was really good at against Jeff Neal. He knew how to keep his hand out there and just range or gauge where the range is and exactly when Jeff's going to come in on him. And I really think that Ian Garry would have to conserve his energy early on, and he might have to give up a round or two to be able to find his openings in the middle parts of the round. For me and the current state of both of their careers, Colby would have an advantage early if he came out hot, and he would have an advantage in the championship rounds. So that tells you rounds 2, 3, and 4 would really need to be hyper-focused for Ian Garry. Ian can't just go out there and try to knock out a guy like Colby in the first minute because he's going to wind up leaving himself compromised or off-balanced, trying to just take Colby's head off, and that's exactly where Colby wants him. You'll wind up in wrestling range, and then he steals the round from you. And Colby has to put the pressure on him for the first round and then make Ian Garry and his corner think, okay, he's going to rinse and repeat. He's going to put the pressure on us until he's got no more gas, and it seems like this guy can go all 5 rounds without running out of gas. But if he pulls back a little bit in round 2 and just has the fear of the takedown in Ian Garry's mind and not the actual takedown itself, then Ian starts to second guess. Wait, can I open up and start striking on this guy? Or do I need to, be defensively sound and watch out for when he changes levels and shoots in? And that's when the game really starts to be played. And Colby Covington, if he comes in with a bulletproof game plan like that, he comes out to try to take down the guy that has, shown us time and time again that he's really good at evading wrestlers. He's really good at evading guys that want to bring the pressure to him. I think Colby Covington would have a decent shot at winning the early parts and the later parts of this fight. To me, it seems like it could instantly be a classic. It could instantly make fight of the night, and it would be one of those ones that gets me on the edge of my seat. It gets me feeling that uneasy, unsettling feeling. And if I'm feeling it, watching it on television, you can only imagine what Ian Garry might be feeling.
Yeah, and I want to touch on one thing that you said earlier in the video about Ian Garry handling the emotions of Colby Covington well. I think he can handle them as well as a 26-year-old who's got a lot of people making fun of him and a lot of people piling on him right now can handle them. The reality of the matter is one of the stipulations in Colby Covington's video that he cut for Ian Garry was that him and his wife both turn their comments back on Instagram. So as it sits right now when we're recording this video, Ian Garry's, you cannot comment on any picture or video that he posts on Instagram.
Yeah.
He has removed that feature from his page. And that gives me a little window into the fact that you can say that things don't affect you. You can say that I'm bulletproof and that my mind is a guarded fortress and that I'm not able to be fazed. But when you do things like cut the comments off, you are shielding yourself from that to a certain degree. And there is no way to cut the comments from Colby Covington off at the press conference.
Right.
And you can't skip that one. This is not like a press conference where you're the feature bout or you're just somebody on the card. You would likely be the co-main event of the evening.
And focal point of the press conference.
And Colby Covington is going to come at Ian Garry at that press conference with more ammunition than perhaps we've ever seen Colby Covington come to a press conference with. And that's saying a lot because we had people like Ariel Helwani after the press conference with Colby Covington and Leon Edwards suggesting that there be some sort of sanctioning body that actually penalizes people for inappropriate or things that cross the line being said at a press conference. I'm not in the same boat with Ariel on that. I'm a big fan, but I disagree. It's the fight game.
Go for the neck.
This is a talk crap business. This is a go for the neck business.
Yeah.
And the reality of the matter is, if you can't handle it, then stay out of the water. And
right.
And when Conor McGregor fought Dustin Poirier and he did the whole "your wife is in my DMs" and everything like that.
Yeah.
I didn't really love that. I thought that was a bit distasteful because Jolie Poirier didn't ever do anything to warrant herself being dragged into the situation.
Unless, of course, she was in the DMs.
Yeah, I mean, like, what are the chances that really happened? I think slim to none.
I don't know.
But for Layla Machado, it's a little bit different.
She's fair game.
She likes the limelight. She has entered herself into the equation. Yeah. She wants to be a figure in the Ian Garry camp. And when you do that, you greenlight yourself for the trash talk. And so, yes, I didn't really love Conor talking about Jolie Poirier that way, but in this kid's situation with Layla Machado, she is fair game. And Colby Covington, if one thing we know about him to be true, he is coming with the heat to the press conference. So Garry would really have to be mentally dialed in that week because some really ugly things are going to be said about him, about his wife, about his wife's ex-husband, who's the father of his adopted child. I mean,
vegan diet.
This is going to get really bad for Ian Garry at the press conference if the fight materializes. So that's going to be a big thing. How strong is his mental game fight week?
Well, yeah, and actions speak louder than words. So Colby's all action. He has no trouble fighting somebody like Ian Garry. But when you say, you come out as this cool, calm, and collected guy like Ian Garry does, and look, I actually was able to meet him in person. He's a very nice guy. He was nice to everybody I saw him interact with. But when you come out with this cool, calm, and collected persona, but then you shut your comments off, it tells you everything. Okay, is that a little bit of a facade? Are we playing a game here? Even when the cameras are off, are you acting? And for me, Colby Covington is going to come for the neck. He's going to try to hurt your feelings. He's going to try to hurt your girlfriend's feelings, your wife, whatever, your baby's mother's feelings. And there's no rules. Anything goes when it comes to Colby Covington, and that's a whole part of his game. Everything down from the punches and the kicks to the week leading up to the fight to the whole. As soon as the fight gets signed, there's 2 months, usually 3 months, for them to build up a fight. And if you want to do good business in this sport, you find people that know how to sell fights. Colby Covington is one of the very few. I can count on the UFC's roster on one hand how many are actually good at selling the fights and promoting things. Colby Covington is absolutely one of them. And with Conor McGregor not being very active these days, he might be sitting in the top spot.
One of them, yeah.
Right. So Colby Covington has no issue going in there and lighting the roof on fire and standing in there right in the middle of it all. And a lot of people watched that call out of Ian Garry. And of course, it went viral. It went crazy. People were commenting on it. I don't think people realize just how incredible that call out was. In my opinion, that's the greatest call out that has ever taken place in modern UFC history. I can't think of anything quite as ridiculous and
offensive, absurd, yeah.
Incredible. Because if you think back, Ian Garry called Colby out in the octagon. He's literally right there with Joe Rogan calling Colby Covington out. Colby doesn't even answer it. He brushes it off. Or so we thought.
Yeah.
And then 5-6 weeks later, he comes back with the most vicious call out I've ever seen. And he's the one who didn't even answer Ian Garry, then comes out, makes his own call out of a guy that just called him out as if the guy didn't even just call him out. And then within a couple of days gets a response from the guy. So that tells you it's definitely starting to work. I'm sure whatever Machado, his wife's name is starting to fire, trying to think of some one-liners she can feed her hubby that he can start to throw at Chaos. None of them are going to land. If you want to see a bludgeoning, you're going to watch the press conference. You're going to watch the build-up to this fight. Colby Covington 10-7'd Ian Garry. And while I think Ian Garry did great in his return fire, it just wasn't the same thing. You can't go back at somebody like that when you only have a day or 2 days to think about what you're going to do. He did as good of a shot as you could possibly do. I'm going to say you retire. He took a book out of Chael's book, right? I'm going to retire, or you're going to retire. Loser retires. That was about as good of a shot as you can take back at Colby. But for me, I think that Colby Covington's coming in and he realizes that Ian Garry could be a world champion one day. Let's not forget, Colby Covington only wants to do business with the best fighters in the world, and most of the time, he's the only one selling the fight. So if Colby's going out there and trying to do business with you, that tells you in this awful way where he's criticizing you, he's calling you out, he's calling out your wife, all of this stuff, that at least there's a little bit of respect there. He knows that this guy's a high-level fighter. He knows that Ian Garry is compelling. People are polarized by him. They either love him or they hate him, but they're going to tune in to watch him fight. And I think Colby Covington realizes that. And at the same time, since he hasn't fought anybody that's not a world champion or a former world champion in God knows how many years, I think he realizes that Ian Garry could be a world champion. And if he loses to him, this loss is going to age like fine wine. You know, if Ian Garry goes on to beat Colby Covington and then wins 2 more fights and he's the world champion suddenly, people aren't going to be like, oh, Colby sucked in that fight. They're like, oh, of course, he lost to a guy who became the world champion, just like the only other times that Colby Covington has ever lost. So for me, I think this is the right call out for Colby. I think it was beautiful. I really hope it happens. And to me, it also feels like both guys want to be active pretty soon. I'd love to see this in June for International Fight Week. If not, push it down the can a little bit further, and maybe we'll see it at the end of summer.
Do you have an early prediction for who would win?
We got to save that one. I don't want to break it down right now.
I went out on a limb and said Garry was my early prediction.
Okay.
It may change.
Okay. Well, it all depends on if the UFC wants to go in that direction. If they want to go in that direction and they let Colby do his thing, what Colby does best, which is he's a mastermind at promotional stuff, then my money's going, and it's 5 rounds as well. My money's leaning towards Colby Covington to get his hand raised. But like you said, there's 10 years difference, and that favors Ian Garry. Also, Colby Covington's been to the top of the mountain before. Ian Garry's never done it. The young, hungry lion, there's always something to be said for that. But it's hard for me to go against the old dog, especially one who's that crazy and that brash and unhinged.
Well said.